Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, and thank you all so much for making the time to be here. So let's give a few minutes to the other people who will still be joining us. And of course, feel free to use the chat box to let us know where you're joining in from. We'd love to hear from you and make this a very engaging session. So we have awesome. Hi, Jacques. Hi, Laurent. Awesome to hear. Hi, Sylvie. Hi, Alexis. Thank you guys for being here today. It's nice to hear the shout outs. Nice. So we have Jacques from Barcelona, Laurent from France, Sylvie from Texas, Alexis from St. Louis. Awesome. Hello, Arib and Jonathan as well. And hello to Linda from Chicago. Nice. We have a very energetic crowd today. Hello, Amanda from the UK. All right. And Anisha from Wisconsin. So I think we will continue to let people join in. Um, but Daniel, I think we're ready to begin. So no worries. I'm going to introduce the session for today. So thank you again for joining us. We'll be tackling a very timely subject. So as the title states, we're going to be discussing the value of corporate climate action in the Trump era. So I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Maggie from Greenlee, and I lead our marketing efforts in North America. And today I'm joined by our very special guest, a sustainability ROI expert and speaker, Daniel Aronson. So I have a whole speech to introduce Daniel today. But before I actually hand over the floor to him, I'm happy to give a quick introduction about Greenlee for those who are joining us for the first time today. So, Greenlee's mission is definitely to make carbon accounting accessible to businesses of all sizes, and definitely to help fight against climate change. So, we're a climate tech company. With over 3,500 clients across more than 20 countries worldwide, and we're managing 50 million tons of carbon emissions and strategically helping these companies reduce their carbon emissions. So what we specialize in is actually a sustainability suite that really helps measure, reduce, and support these companies transition into a climate expertise. And of course, just to know more about some customer success stories, I'm happy to share a resource on the chat that you can easily download. It's a one pager about how Greenlee helps companies ROI, because that's a big topic that we're going to be discussing today. And moving on to the agenda, just in terms of what to expect today, first is the introduction, a very short introduction of our theme and our guest speaker. And then the main discussion that will be led by Daniel. And then, of course, we have a Q&A portion. But if you have questions at any time, feel free to put them in the chat box. And of course, then we'll conclude the session just after that. So, all right, let's get straight into it. So, in an era where traditional ROI falls short, corporate climate action isn't just about profit. It's really about uncovering the submerged value that will define resilient leadership under a changing political tide. So, as regulatory uncertainty rises in the current era, um, in the US, forward thinking companies are shifting from short term ROI to long term value creation. And what does that mean? It's about quantifying climate action through risk mitigation, investor pressure, and also access to over $3 trillion in sustainable capital markets. And with growing skepticism about sustainability, the question today is what really is the value of corporate climate action for businesses today? And with that, I transition into my introduction of our special guest. So after this, the floor is all yours, Daniel, but I'm happy to introduce who you are to our guests today. So, our esteemed guest speaker today, he is the founder of Valitus, which specializes in creating value through sustainability and responsibility. He is the creator of Value of Values, the book, and also the book, The Value of Values, which is published by the MIT Press. He has helped companies quantify over $2 billion in sustainability driven business value. So Daniel actually coined the term submerged value and is the creator of materiality science. So he has guest lectured at Harvard Business School and MIT Sloan Sustainability Lab. Daniel holds an MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management and a BA with high honors from UC Berkeley. And he's currently joining us live from New York. I'm happy to turn over the slides and the presentation to you, Daniel.
Great. Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here. This is a really, really important topic, and one that has become all the more so recently, and one in which I think there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of confusion about. We're going to go through some of the main things. At the end of today, you'll understand better why is it so difficult to quantify the value of climate action? What can we do about some of these challenges? And why is it so important, especially today, especially in today's environment? To begin with, let's start with a little bit of context. If you're here today, you may be thinking we're in a race against time to save the planet. But there's a race within that race also. And there's another simultaneous race on top of that, which gives us three simultaneous races. The first one, the race against time. This is to do the right thing to solve the climate crisis and so forth. Then there's a second race, which is the race against competition. And then there's the third race, the race for advancement and career satisfaction. One challenge is that all of these things have to come together. And the actions that you take to help the world also need to contribute to winning the other two races. Plus, in today's environment, there's yet another barrier. The new wall is the wall of increased opposition and increased non-monetary cost to action. Things like people objecting to clean energy, or there being rollback of regulations, or at least a delaying of the regulations that you thought were imminent. This wall is about uncertainty and about increased vocal opposition. When you put these three simultaneous races together with the wall, you get a challenging environment, and that's what we're here to talk about today. To begin with, let's start with some basic facts. IBM asked 3,000 CEOs what was their number one barrier to climate and sustainability action, and the answer was uncertain or unclear ROI. Now, you may hear people say, well, we need to make the moral case and we need to talk about how this is important for all kinds of reasons. And it is. But when you ask CEOs, the number one barrier that they say is, in fact, ROI. And when you ask sustainability professionals, which KPMG did, you get two answers tied for first, one of which is ROI and the other is capacity. This is especially a big deal when it comes to the second race, the race against the competition for success in the marketplace. The reason that this race is important is twofold. One is, if you are a CEO and your company underperforms financially and you've invested in sustainability, you are more likely to get fired. Of course, underperforming CEOs are always more likely to get fired, but if those CEOs are also doing something about sustainability, that increases the chance that they'll get fired by 50 to 200%. There's a second reason also, which is that there's now a greater cost in non-monetary terms, attention, opposition, and so forth, criticism, to taking action on climate. And if you can't say, hey, this is benefiting the company financially, then you can imagine a CEO saying, wait a minute, I was already more likely to get fired if I did this and we didn't perform. But in today's environment, this would be an even bigger increase in the chance of being fired. That makes it seem as if you can either take the road that leads toward money, or you can take the road that leads toward doing the right thing, but not both. Now, it turns out this isn't true, but we need to ground our understanding in the idea that people believe this is true. They feel it. They feel, even if they don't know the statistics, they feel intuitively that if they don't perform financially and they are involved in climate action, they're going to be more likely to get fired, more likely to get criticized. The solution to this idea that you have the two roads and they diverge is to understand that the vast majority of value from climate action and sustainability is submerged, by which I mean hidden beneath the surface. Now, there are lots of different ways to show this, but for a bit of a different way, let me retell a specific story that you may have heard before. And the reason I use this story is that people often think, you know, climate, sustainability, those are the ideas of fables and not finance. But what's interesting is, even when you take a story that people already know, when you look a little bit behind the curtain, you discover the submerged value hidden in plain sight. Let's take the case of the boy who cried wolf. What is the cost of the boy's dishonesty in this story? Well, it's the loss of his family's entire flock, which is more than would have been gained if they'd done things that are typically considered to be clear business imperatives, like feed the sheep a high-growth diet, or engage a wool marketing consultant, or even use AI to optimize grazing patterns. In fact, that loss is more than all of these things put together, and yet it goes uncounted. And that's an example of how, even when you look at stories that seem to be about values, there's very often submerged value hiding in plain sight. Now, what that means for us is that we need to surface that submerged value. We need to point it out and quantify it so that people don't see a conflict between the three simultaneous races, but instead they see this is a way to do all of those things at once, to be better for my career, to be better for my company, and to be better for my society and my planet. Here's a concrete business example of a European manufacturer, about 20 billion euros, that said, we want to reduce waste in our factories, but it'll take investment and we can't figure out how to make it pay off. It turns out this is another example of submerged value, because although they were thinking of the cost to haul away the waste as being saved, that wasn't very much. It was about 10 cents a kilo, 5 cents a pound. It just wasn't enough. But there were a couple dozen other factors of value that they were missing. For example, if you don't have to order more because you didn't waste it, you have to put that in the accounts payable system. And you don't have to put it on the ship and then take it off the ship and put it on the truck and then put it in the forklift and then put it in the warehouse, which means you don't have to heat, cool, and insure as much warehouse space. And people don't get hurt moving it because you never bought it, they never moved it to begin with. And the whole time, you aren't soaking up working capital, which is clearly not free. And you aren't increasing inventory levels, which, as Lean tells us, is costly. In total, there are about 24 other factors of value that are submerged in just this simple case of lowering waste. And when you see the submerged value, it turns out it's many times more than the value that people see that's easily visible. Where do we find this value? 4 places: in the behavior of customers, of operations, of risks, and employees. Now, I want to focus on concrete behaviors because one of the things that people often criticize sustainability people for is saying, yeah, it's good, we want to save the polar bears and so on, but you have this sort of grandiose idea that this reflects stock price, but stock price is influenced by all these things and there's all this conflict. Okay, sure. But there are also specific concrete behaviors that change, that affect the business at the core level. And that's where submerged value lives. To take the example of customers, we all know that customers don't just buy a product, they buy an experience, right? This is true in all kinds of ways. They buy the experience of it and they buy what it says about them, who they want to be. In fact, one of the most influential papers in a top marketing journal is one that says, treat customers and sell them who they want to be, not just the thing that you want them to buy. Now, this is intuitive, but what's interesting is it's true not just in things like chocolate and luxury goods, but even in something as common as cleaning supplies. One company told its customers and prospects that they were really involved in climate action. What happened? First, the customers and prospects were more likely to prefer the product. But second, they actually said it smelled better. The cleaning supplies smelled better once people knew about climate action. That's because all of these things shape our experience of the product, not just the thing itself. Now, you may hear people say, yeah, that's nice, but climate action, sustainability is just the icing on the cake. And here's the response to that. One, it's true, but two, not in the way that the person saying it believes. Because picture going into a bakery. Picture opening the door, walking in, seeing the smells, looking at the cases. What do you notice about the cakes in the bakery? They are all iced. Even in the literal case of the icing on the cake, businesses know it matters. And it turns out this is even more the case when products are very similar. For example, my company, Valutus, has conducted experiments resulting in over 500,000 causal data points on 4 continents. Not just surveys of correlation, like, are the people who like climate also the people most likely, who say they're most likely to buy the product? That's nice, but it's not causal. What we've done is experiments where we see if, when customers and prospects are aware, it actually changes their preference experimentally. And what have we found? We found that if you're ahead in these areas, you see a preference increase. On the left is the baseline level of preference, and then different sustainability attributes, including climate leadership, are on the right. If you fall behind, there's a preference decrease. That is, if you're not doing climate action and someone else is, you may see your preference fall and theirs rise. And this is especially true in some places. Here's an example from the United Kingdom. Look at the decline in preference because of being behind. Now, we can actually quantify this, and we have. We have a whole tool that does this. And I'll show you very quickly what that looks like. But if you want, feel free to reach out. You have your basic, size of the company, revenue, so forth. You have different aspects of customer preference, where sustainability and responsibility and climate and so forth are a small fraction of the total. In this case, about 0.5%. Right? So in total, you're getting 1% of the total score allocated to these things. And then there's the effect on retailers and shelf space and distributors. there's the effect on loyalty, and then finally you have the total effect on revenue and margin, which it turns out is quite substantial, even if the weight of sustainability and climate action isn't that great. Now let's think about that for a second. Why would it be the case that even if the weight of sustainability and climate action isn't that high, its effect might still be high? I'm going to pause here for a second. Put in the chat the reason that you think that is. Let's hear what people think. Okay, I'll give you a couple more seconds. All right. The reason for that is that it's an incremental effect. Even if something else is more important, like does the cleaning product clean? Cleaning is an advantage that has been mostly, if not completely, competed away, right? The definition of a commodity market is one in which these things have been competed away. But climate action, sustainability are not like that. There's much more incremental room for growth, which means a lot more value to be generated by being a leader, because the other attributes like price, quality, and so forth are all very close together. Okay, that's customers. We're now going to talk about operations. Now, operations is about seeing differently. And there are lots of examples of this, but I'm just going to mention one. There was a company that they were flaring the gas, the natural gas that came from one of their wells. And that was because it was the easiest thing to do. It wasn't very expensive, comes out the top, you light it on fire. But of course, this created a very large carbon footprint. Well, they looked at what else they could do with the gas. And it turns out they could capture it, compress it, and sell it. They also found that they had an existing machine that with very small modifications could do this work. It was just sitting unused. What was the ROI of this new vision that they had of the replacement for just flaring it? The ROI was about 30,000%. 30,000%. Very few investments in any company generate that kind of return. And what was involved was little more than a shift in what we look for, what we perceive, and therefore what opportunities we see operationally. Now, there are lots more examples, and in my book, I talk about a lot more, including examples from IBM and so forth. But for the purpose of today, let's move on to risks. Risks is about looking differently, whereas operations is about seeing differently, and customers more about feeling differently. Risk is more about looking differently. And here again, let's come back to climate action specifically. Earlier this decade, my company did a research project looking at top future forecasters, organizations, and so on. Things like the European Union, the big accounting consulting firms, the US Department of Defense, and so on. And looked at what were the biggest factors influencing the decade we're in now. Number 2 was AI. What was number 1? Climate. Climate has all kinds of effects. Where people live, what they do, the economy, the ability to move things and people, health, and so on. It was number 1 across all these different organizations, even though 90% of the organizations were not sustainability focused. And as an additional benefit, and this is what I mean about looking differently, thinking about purpose, thinking about climate and sustainability and benefiting the world actually helps you see things differently, according to McKinsey. And it helps you identify risks you would otherwise miss. The reason is that if you're not thinking about this, you're wearing rose-colored glasses. And as Zachary Parker says, when that happens, red flags just look like flags. Here's an example of how that can be done better and more visually. And you can see here we can overlay over the map different heat regions, different fires. We can add those to, say, cyclonic winds like hurricanes and so forth. We can look at wildfires, and we can put all of these things together so that you can see them in one grand vision for the world. If you're not doing this, then you very well may be missing how the total context of the business is affected by these clear factors like change in the climate. And if you're not thinking about how to address these clear factors, your competition might be. Now, when it comes to employees, in a way, this is the most obvious because people intuitively get what John Wooden said, which is that good values are like a magnet, they attract good people. But there's much more to it than that, and this intuition needs to be quantified. For example, when you are more of a climate leader, more people are interested in working for you, especially the most talented people who, as the former CEO of Cemex in Mexico said, the most talented people, no matter the economy, are always in demand. There's also the flip side, which is that values can repel the people you want as well. If you make something that makes people less happy, more isolated, then people may think, if you're not a force for good, why would I want to work for you? And that's exactly what Jonathan Vanian said about Meta and Facebook. People are not sure if they're a force for good or evil, and therefore they're not sure they want to work there. There's also the positive side of this, which is increasing productivity. The US Department of Defense published a study showing that an increase in engagement led to an increase in productivity. Makes sense? Here's the quantification. I once worked with an executive who was the head of this function for a 60,000 person hospitality and entertainment company. I asked her, how much do you think it's worth that employees know you share their values? She said $3 million a year. Three things. One, that's great. Most people, the answer is, I don't know. And if you put I don't know into Excel, you get 0. Second thing is, she said, but my executives would say 300,000. Problem with that is that it's not only 1/10, but for a 60,000 person company, it's $5 a person. That's just not going to get a lot of attention. The third thing is that when we actually did the calculation using a model that we have with a couple dozen different inputs and so on, and here you can see it looking at the number of employees and where they're located, average salaries, loaded costs, hires per year, and so forth. If you want, we can just let me know if you want to dive into this more deeply. But when you include the costs of doing it and you net that against the benefits, you get almost 100 times what her C-suite thought, almost $30 million in her case. That's a big difference. And that means that instead of the value that the executives thought, or even the value that this individual thought, the value is much higher. And that's much more of a thing that people want to go get and to put investment and attention behind. In addition, this is a time of the world in all sorts of ways when we need more organizational resilience against shocks. And as it turns out, 5 of Aon's top 10 factors that make your workforce resilient are sustainability related. And climate leadership has personal benefits as well. As LeVar Burton says, he couldn't follow someone that didn't share his values. This is, again, bringing us back to the personal career part that we talked about before. That race, in addition to the competitive race. In fact, if you go all the way back to Aristotle, when he talked about ethos, pathos, and logos, the three fundamental building blocks of persuasion, ethos has the same root as the word ethics. It's about who you are as a leader. Okay, this is all great, but we know there's also a period of challenge facing us. Here are three that we've heard and some thoughts on what to do. The first is it's fuzzy. What people typically do is try to use qualitative benefits, but that's not speaking the language of business, and that doesn't work. You need to use the quantitative benefits like we've shown throughout this, including the calculators. The second is people understand there's a cost of inaction, but have a very difficult time quantifying it. And as a result, they typically leave it out. But that gives it a value of 0, which, as MIT's John Sterman says, is the only value it can't possibly have. And the third is we have conflicting pressures, especially in today's political environment, but there are also all kinds of other pressures. What people often do is they try to avoid the spotlight. But here's the problem. 2 and 3 combined, that is the cost of inaction and avoiding the spotlight, bring to the forefront this question of what are the consequences of inaction? Imagine that this is where your company is located. And here are the other companies. And here they are in terms of their sustainability. So you're above average for sustainability and climate action in your industry. You think, my choice is to move there or not, right? I can choose to just stay where I am. But it turns out that's not really true. Because even if you move here, what happens? Everybody else is also thinking, hey, this is kind of something that we should pay attention to and do something about. And the entire industry is moving that way, which means if you fall behind, then you suffer the consequences with customers and employees and so forth, including, remember the cost of being a laggard that we looked at with the customers section? That's real money. And it's not dependent on you making the choice between doing something and doing nothing. The choice is between doing something and getting farther ahead, or doing nothing, getting farther behind. Even if you just keep up, doing nothing is not doing nothing. It's letting others go in front. And here are some examples of something that we all intuitively understand, which is that over the past few years, there has in general been a sustainability activity increase across lots and lots of different industries. Now, this brings us to the question of what do we do about that number one barrier that we talked about earlier? The number one barrier, ROI. You cut a hole in that wall. You cut a hole in that wall by quantifying and surfacing submerged value, and thereby demonstrating the value of values and the value of climate action.
Awesome. Very interesting and a fresh perspective on trying to discuss the value of corporate action. Thank you so much, Daniel, for a very interesting storytelling approach on trying to emphasize, submerged value. For a lot of people, maybe is it the first time that you've heard of the term submerged value? And of course, feel free to use the chat, about your thoughts, and I think it's the right time actually for us to ask you if you guys have any specific questions about, anything that Daniel has spoken about. So please feel free to engage in the chat and let us know if you have any questions or clarifications, or maybe you want him to deep dive into a specific topic or something that he mentioned. Let's wait a bit. Okay, I see Alexis is typing in the chat.
I'm taking a look at the polls
Yes.
and the questions because I think that
Okay, we we have a
even if
question.
people don't specifically put that question in the chat, I think the idea that 70% of people are
Mm-hmm.
not measuring
Yeah,
quantitative and qualitative ROI leads to the question, why not? What can be done? How can we make it easier and so forth?
exactly. Very good observation. And yeah, thank you guys for engaging in the polls. That's absolutely right, Daniel. Like, it's interesting to know why are you not measuring your ROI? There is a question over here from Carol asking you, Daniel, is your ROI quantification tool publicly available?
Hi, Carol. Thanks for the question. The answer is some of them are and some of them aren't. I just finished making a tool with New York University, NYU, where I'm also an executive in residence, which is about the effect of climate action on the PE ratio for stock price. It turns out there's a lot of conflicting information about the effect of sustainability and climate action on stock price. But as far as we can tell, the largest study of its type, over 16,000 equities representing 80% of the market capitalization of all the stock markets in the world over 4 years. The result of that was that if a company lowers emissions, it increases the PE ratio, which means for any given level of earnings, stock price goes up. There are a number of different, let's say, research reports, papers, and so forth that have looked at the situation somewhat differently and come to different conclusions. But this one is the biggest by far. And their specific approach to look at the PE ratio was really interesting. So that's publicly available on the NYU website, which is, you want to look for the Center for Sustainable Business at NYU. Some of the other ones are partially publicly available, or if you want a demonstration, I'd be happy to give you one in person. But some of the other ones are more proprietary for use by companies and service providers. We, for example, license them. But you can take a look at the NYU one for free. We also have a ton of resources that you can use to get more done. So in fact, if you don't, do you mind if I share for a second?
Yes, go ahead. And we do have a few other questions in the chat and in the question box. Go
Great,
ahead.
great. Because I wanted to make sure that people have a chance to download or collect the valuation resources that I've provided for just for this audience for free.
Awesome. So if you have a moment, feel free to scan the QR code that Daniel is now flashing. And I believe I can ask the next question
Great.
while this is flashed. So from Alexis, she asks, can you speak more about sustainability and organizational resilience with Anon?
Sure. The company Aon is a very large HR and people consultancy and service provider and so forth. And the idea here is fairly simple. If you want people to be more resilient, then you want to not only connect them on the level of, if you do the job that you're supposed to do, we'll pay you. But you want to connect them on the level of their values, the things that they want in the world. Because when people really want something and it connects them in a human way, they are more willing to figure out a way around, through, over, under those walls. And when you give your workforce those kinds of tools, when you engage with them in a human way, when you make them feel like they belong, what Aon found is that that workforce is more resilient. And in a world where business is constantly being buffeted by policies and economics and market changes and climate events and everything else, the more resilient company has an advantage.
Hopefully, this answers your question, Alexis. I think very clearly stated. Thank you, Daniel, for answering. So we have about three more questions, which I can see. From Bethany, she asks, what are the usual submerged values that you would start with if you were looking at total costs?
The places to start with quantifying and capturing submerged value. Typically, number one is people often don't know what you're doing. And this is a simple very inexpensive opportunity to capture. Because I was once working with a company that was quite large, and they donated over $100 million worth of technology to educational institutions every year. And most of their employees didn't even know they did that. And if your employees don't know, imagine the customers, right? The first thing you can do is to recognize a very simple fact, which is if people don't know, they can't prefer you because of what you're doing. Right? Remember the company that makes the cleaning supplies. Most of their companies didn't know what they were doing in climate, even though they've been doing it for a long time. Second thing is to put on the sustainability lenses in terms of operations. That is, remember the example. If you tell people, hey, look around for ways we can reduce our climate impact, rethink your operation, rethink the way that this is done, rethink who we buy from. Often you find tremendous value. I didn't include in today's talk, but in the book, there's an example from IBM. They found about $750,000 in reduction in water cost when they went looking to reduce their water use, but they found 4 times that much in energy and productivity and other savings. 4 times as much. And that's very common. And of course, climate specifically in GHG and emissions, energy use and emissions often signal where you can look for cost savings as well as GHG savings. For risks, it's a little bit more complicated, but you need to start by telling people what you're thinking about is not including these major risks. And if you were to buy insurance against those risks, it would be costly, which means you are self-insuring by definition, and therefore that's a costly mistake. And employees, again, that's similar to what I mentioned earlier about customers. You need to let employees know what you're doing, and you can do things for free, like include some of your values in the hiring questions that you ask and the things that you tell prospects.
Very true. So it's really about communication as well, internally and externally, about these efforts.
Yeah.
Hopefully, this answers your question, Bethany. I'm moving on to the next question. We have Vitor, who asks, do you believe that AI could unlock climate actions for SMEs? How do you see that? Because they represent 90% of Fortune 500 companies' emissions.
Yes, AI certainly could be used for that. It could also, AI is a powerful tool. Like any powerful tool, it could be used to improve the climate situation or to make it worse. Right? Big data, social media, all of these things have all kinds of uses. But yes, in particular for SMEs, AI offers the possibility of being able to get a handle on the tremendous amount of data and the tremendous number of responses that are requested by big companies, by consumers, and so forth, without having to hire a huge team. One of the biggest issues that I run into when I talk to SMEs is that the person who's doing that job, either they're a team of one, or it's not even their full-time job. It's, the director of this and sustainability or and climate. And done correctly, AI can really help with that. It can help you to analyze your data, can help you to analyze what others are doing, and it can make it much faster. As an example, we recently published a piece, which is free, about analyzing over 250 different reports that are compliant with CSRD in Europe. We were able to do that because of our expertise. We have CSRD tools and we have a lot of experience with that, but also because we were able to use AI to help to do some of the grunt work. The caution is that you have to be very careful with how you structure the problem and what questions you ask. I asked the same question 5 different ways as part of that analysis and got 4 different answers. What we then had to do was to come back and put the human intelligence on top of that. That was still faster than it would have been to do it without any help. And that's where SMEs can really benefit.
Very clear answer. And the prompt is definitely very important. We have 2 more questions. One from Cian or Sean. Hopefully, I'm saying your name correctly. Um, Here it asks, is there a way of making qualitative data robust enough to use? Thinking about purpose led companies and B Corp, we want to be pushing against just using finances as success, right?
Uh, okay,
Maybe.
three responses. Number one is you can not entirely make qualitative data robust enough to use, but you can use it by analogy. You can say, well, we know that we should, for example, be, well, here's a simple example. We know that customers care about the relationship with their salesperson, even though that obviously doesn't change the price, it doesn't change the performance or the quality of the product, right? But how do we know? Because salespeople take their customers to dinner. They ask them, hey, how are your kids? They make a personal connection with them. In the same way, if customers' personal values include sustainability and climate action, then we should take those things into account. Second part of this response is that unfortunately, number one is not enough. My suggestion is not to stop trying to quantify, but just to do a better job, even if it's a very broad range, right? Even if you say maybe it's 3%, 5%, 7%, even if you run a bunch of different scenarios. The key thing is that when you have only qualitative benefits, in most cases, that leads to the number being assigned to it of 0. And it's not 0. Anything above 0 is worth it, right? Even if you say, what do you think it is? And they say 10%. Here's what you do. You say, let's cut that in half and say 5%. This makes it look like you're being very conservative, which is true. In this case, you're being very conservative. And it increases your credibility. And it's still not 0. In fact, it's a lot more than 0. The third part of this is, let me push back on the idea that you don't want to emphasize financial results. I don't think there's any way of getting around the weight that financial results have, period. Maybe in a different world, in a different economy and so forth, it would be less of a thing. But if you're not talking about at least maintaining financial results and hopefully improving them, then you run into the problem that those three simultaneous races start to conflict. Somebody says, I want to do the right thing, but I can't afford for my company to go bankrupt or for me to lose my job. What we need to do is we need to show that there are a lot of cases when these things are aligned. And you can at least start by doing those things.
Hopefully, this answers your question. I think that was a very detailed and comprehensive answer. And I think we have a last question over here, which is from Cillian. Do you have any insight to share on the diminishing returns sustainability may have in future years in the US thanks to the Trump administration?
Yes, a few things. First, yes, some of the value that sustainability used to have will be going away or will be diminished. For example, things like incentives and things like better purchasing preference from government contractors. And some of the costs of engaging in sustainability are going to go up because not only is there the actual financial cost, managerial cost, and so forth, but there's going to be more criticism, more pushback. At one point, a number of the state level officials from states that were opposed to climate action actually started to pull away from companies that did climate action, or to push them for regulatory justifications or things like that to try to make them stop acting on climate. And one of the things that I think people don't acknowledge enough is that there are some people who, for whatever reason, ideology or because of their own self-interest in some way, are opposed to climate action. Sometimes people talk about climate action as everyone knows it's a good thing, but that's just not the case. Some years ago, I was maybe the first, I'm not sure, but one of the first that I knew of anyway, to publish the results of a study that showed that Although most people would not have their choices affected by climate action among the company that they were choosing from, and a good number would be willing to prefer a company because of climate action, there was a smaller number that would actively punish a company for acting on climate. They would actually avoid buying from the climate leader. Now, in net, it was still beneficial to be a climate leader. But there are people who are opposed. And one of the things about the current situation is that those people are more vocal and more powerful. And also that it's impossible to avoid seeing them now, the way it was when I first published the results some years ago. Therefore, two things. One is you can talk about this with the audiences that are more likely to respond positively and less with the ones that are more likely to respond negatively. And the second thing is that if you want to continue to do things around climate, then you're going to need to do better showing the ROI, because ROI is seen as less ideological a justification. Oh, you're doing this to make money. Okay, that's seen as less ideological than you're doing this to benefit the environment or planet or so forth, which means you need to do better at conservatively estimating, but surfacing and quantifying the submerged value.
All right. Very great question to end with for this webinar. I think there are definitely the challenges that are currently being faced, and you're absolutely right that it's important to begin. So we did see that a lot of you have posed the answer that you are not yet measuring ROI, but hopefully this gives you an idea and inspires you to start today. I think that is, of course, what we would love to encourage, aside from already doing corporate climate action and sustainability efforts. It's important, of course, to measure that as well, to measure the ROI for that as well. And so the few minutes left, we are moving on towards a conclusion for the webinar. No matter the political climate, the business case for sustainability remains clear: reducing risk, meeting stakeholder expectations, and unlocking long term value. Inaction is no longer a neutral stance or a choice. Climate leadership is still the smartest investment a company can make. And I think what we all have to remember here is that sustainability, it's a long-term value-driven commitment. Just because political climates may change, I think if you are truly committed to the mission, there are ways to live by this further. And we really hope that this session empowers you to continue championing sustainability. We did see that some of you are already champions of climate action in your own companies. And if you aren't yet, I think it's already a huge step that you're here with us today. And hopefully you continue to influence not just your company, but also your other spheres of influence. So we are happy to have you all here. And with that, we would definitely like you. We would definitely like to thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if you want to connect me on LinkedIn, please feel free. I put it in the chat, and there's a QR code on the screen. We have a couple of hundred published pieces on this topic, and you're welcome to find those and use them. And as Maggie says, things go up and down, but a lot has changed and a lot hasn't changed. Customers still care. Employees still care. And politics can only overrule physics for so long.
Amazing last word. Very inspiring, even for me. And I hope it's been inspiring for all of you. Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. We're very happy to have um, a guest speaker who's been in this for a very long time. Thank you so much, everyone, as well. And we look forward to having you join us in our next webinars and other sessions. So, wishing you all a good day from wherever you're joining from. We'll stay in touch. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.